Good afternoon. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the Healthy Indoors Live Show. I'm your host, Bob Krell. I'm founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors Magazine. And as always, it's great to have you here. Um, so we've got a great show today. I say that every week, but we do have a great show today. I'm super excited about our guests. We'll get into that in a moment. But let's talk a little bit about where you're coming from and how you got here. Many of you are probably familiar with our healthyindoors.com website. That's kind of our mothership. But we actually are live streaming here, and many of you are watching us now live on the Healthy Indoors online global community, which is our online indoor environmental sustainability centric platform that everybody should be part of. We do a lot of exciting things there. Just recently, we started adding what we call our AMA Ask Me Anything series. With Once a month, we do this for the members of our community, and we bring on core subject matter experts. This couple weeks back or a week and a half ago, we had Jeff May was on and did that program with us. So that's one of the benefits of being a member. If you're not a member, hey, you should become a member today. So go to healthyindoors.global and you can do that. So that's pretty exciting. So today's topic, and we were really bouncing around trying to come up with what the title for the show is going to be, but how will the new federal initiatives in the indoor environmental aspect affect our industry? And by our industry, I collectively mean all the industries that are under the umbrella of indoor environments, right? It's one big tent. We have HVAC, we've got IAQ practitioners, we've got a lot of different places we're coming from. So recently, the federal government, both the White House and Congress enacted a few things. The Clean Air in Buildings Challenge came out earlier this year in 2022. We'll get into that document, and that's something that will drive I think, some changes in the industry, or could. And more recently, the legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, has a lot of it in there for electrification and upgrades. And again, I think things that are going to have perhaps a pretty significant impact on what's happening in our industry, or at least it certainly has the potential to be a pretty significant impact. So we're going to get right back and introduce our guests. Bryan Orr and Nate Adams are joining us today. We'll be back right after a word from our sponsors. So joining us today, first guest will be Bryan Orr. Bryan is the co-owner of Kalo Services Incorporated. It's an Orlando area-based HVAC contracting business. He's also the host of the HVAC School podcast. He created HVAC School to be the free training for HVACR across many mediums for techs by techs. He's been a guest on our show a lot back in 2022 region, and we're really happy to have Bryan back on. Also joining us will be Nate Adams. Nate Adams has his new initiative. He's first of all, a regular contributing editor for Healthy Indoors Magazine, but his latest initiative is HVAC 2.0, and we'll talk to him a little bit about that in a bit. So I guess without further ado, it's time to introduce our guys. Hey, how are you? Nate, Bryan.
Hey, thanks for having us, Bob.
Super excited to have you both on, because you're both smarter than me, which will make this an interesting show. And I will tend to tease good questions out of you, hopefully. So I guess the overview 2022. Do you think? I mean, there's some new stuff in the works, right? Is this a monumental year, or is this the same kind of stuff we've heard in different forms over the years? Thoughts on that? Is like anything new happening, or is it just?
I don't know, the new refrigerants. I'm sure Bryan has a lot of thoughts on, because that's I'm kind of expecting first half next year to be, we'll just say, interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so my take on it is, as soon as we know what's up, like we know what actions there are to take, then we'll know. And so, like as an example of what Nate just brought up, what we're seeing with sort of the SEER 2.0 standard and some of the effects that that's having on equipment, what we're seeing in terms of the energy efficiency standard changes with straight cool equipment, and then what we're seeing with refrigerants, those are all knowns. And so, yes, we've got a lot of stuff that we're working on that is going to be a major impact to our industry. Some of the stuff we're talking about today, as far as, some of these new, kind of White House initiatives, EPA initiatives, I don't know. There's just so many questions, and there's plenty to talk about, but it's really hard to say what impacts these are going to have.
I mean, I guess the first question would be for me is how has this pandemic that we're still not totally out of, but maybe it's calmed down a bit. How has that affected the HVAC industry, or has it affected the HVAC industry?
I don't know if we've ever seen anything that's impacted it more from my perspective. One of the first things that's been a massive change is just availability of products, and that has to do both with an increase in demand, which we've shown statistically, which nobody anticipated that. Nobody anticipated that we were going to have a pandemic and then demand was going to shrink. I mean, demand was going to increase significantly. A lot of us thought it was going to shrink. And then the manufacturing capabilities of the suppliers was impacted, shipping was impacted. And so we've got this challenge right now where there's so many of these things that are coming down the pike as far as regulations, but we're just trying to get systems to serve our clients who are already asking for it. And so you have this conflict between this tyranny of the urgent, which is how on earth do we even provide cool air and heating to our clients when we often can't get the equipment that we need or the materials that we need or the parts that we need to repair them. And now we've got all these additional things that are layering on top, which are putting that burden on manufacturing as well as contracting.
Nate, what do you think? What have you seen change in your world since the pandemic?
Well, definitely a lot more focus on indoor air quality, but like the equipment availability has been pretty wild because the Carrier Greenspeed's long been my personal favorite piece of equipment, and it's very common amongst our contractors. But you haven't been able to get it, so that's been really strange. It's just nothing has been very smooth in the last year and a half, and then on top of it all, there's massive price increases over the last 18 months. So it's been a pretty challenging business climate. And like Bryan said, now there's the other things that we'll be talking about on this show that are going to get layered on top. The EPA thing, Bryan can talk to that, but the incentives for electrification are going to take an already fairly complicated sale and make it more complicated. And so that may actually make things harder, not easier, which was, the hope from it. So yeah, next year, I'm both excited and terrified.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the general consensus in the industry, and it's great. Like they float out a lot of these, these concepts and what they propose doing, but what will actually happen. So I guess specifically, let's get into the Clean Air Challenge a little bit. So it's realistically it's a 2-page document, for the most part, and this document. This is as prescriptive as it gets, guys, right? This is what we got here. We got some footnotes and everything, but it's not a super prescriptive document, and I think that's something Bryan brought up in the pre-show. It's like, it, I guess so. The first question is, how will this affect? Because it seems like it leans heavily towards the HVAC service industry. The contractors and HVAC companies doing a lot of this work, ventilation checks, doing maintaining filtration, outside air. All that sounds great, but is that something even is that remotely feasible for the industry to do?
Well, so I don't have any resentment towards it. Or I should say, I don't have much resentment towards it. I mean, everything's sort of. I feel resentful about a lot of things right now, just because we're trying to serve our customers. But it's a good list. It's got a lot of good stuff in the document. One interesting thing right off the bat that I wonder about is that it's talking about clean air. So it just uses clean air, but really what it's talking about is the microbial side. So like the viral side, the bacterial side. But that's kind of a tricky one. So it doesn't talk about, at least not that I could see, with any significant to any significant degree. It doesn't talk about humidity control. It doesn't talk about the PM 2.5 side of this. And it's talking a lot about sort of the dilution of that viral load and using, upgraded filters, MERV 13 plus, upgraded filtration and all that, which of course does deal with the particle side. But what happens a lot of times when we begin to talk about trying to reduce the microbes in a structure, we often focus on some of the wrong things from my perspective. And I see that again, like we're talking about, doing some of the UV, kind of like sealing UV systems. And I think that's a perfectly good technology, but I often think that we focus in the wrong areas early on. And there's so many things that are fundamentally wrong with buildings that we do need to work on. And this document addresses that. But how can an AC technician really do that? Like they need to first know how to measure things, and they don't, because there actually often aren't tools that make it really easy to do so. It's getting better, but that's actually kind of tricky sometimes. Like, how do you measure outdoor air? Everybody's got a different way. Most technicians don't have precision manometers on their trucks in order to do a pitot tube test. Most of them don't know how to do a timed average or a log Chebyshev traverse with a vane anemometer in order to measure outdoor airflow. And most times you don't have access to the outdoor to where you're bringing the intake in easily without a ladder or getting on a roof or whatever the case may be. So there's all these things that it's like we can say this and we can all agree of its importance of controlling outdoor air, bringing in outdoor air, that ventilation piece, the filtration piece, and the humidity control piece. First off, this leaves out the humidity control piece because there's the argument we should increase humidity to reduce viruses, at least viruses like COVID. And then there's the argument we should decrease humidity for fungal bacteria somewhere in between. And so we don't have answers to a lot of these things. And that's the problem when you use this really broad sweeping generalizations to try to solve big problems. IAQ is not a broad sweeping problem. It's tailored to the building and the needs of that building and the fundamental challenges that exist with the building.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally concur with that. This document and this Clean Air in Buildings Challenge is definitely a product of the pandemic, right? It's definitely the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's tailored toward that. There's no question about it. That's really and I guess anticipating that we will probably experience another event or a series of events like this in the future, which undoubtedly we probably will now. So I think it's important. But you're right; they missed the boat. I mean, because it's not as simple as you can just come in and make a couple of tweaks and you fix everything and IAQ is solved. Right? It's because it's an all-encompassing issue. Yeah, and I guess to the extent that it's expecting that the HVAC contracting community is going to fix these problems, or at least triage them. I don't know.
Well, in the midst of a labor shortage, let's add some extra time to that sort of thing. Yeah, this is really challenging, and I think both of your objections are similar to ours, which are that when you try to do prescriptive stuff, it oftentimes it ends up ignoring a lot of things. So, like, personally, I tend to kind of ignore the letter of the law on a whole lot of things, but I really try to adhere to the spirit of it. So helping people understand the why and then what the potential what might be could be helpful. But in the course of normal service and replacement, this is a kind of a tough thing to layer on top.
Well, and the other thing I think they've done here is they've, if you look at some of these bullet points, especially in the creating the action plan, it's like assess if you need to manage direction of airflows and stuff. This is more like a test and balance thing than a typical HVAC contractor is going to be doing. So there's like they kind of convoluted a lot of this stuff together, and then I mean doing regular inspections and maintenance and filter replacements and system upgrades. That's certainly in the wheelhouse of the mechanical contractors, but they're putting an awful lot there, and I guess the next question is, can the HVAC industry provide a workforce to handle this work? Because that's kind of what this document's alluding to, right? It's kind of saying, will the HVAC, the HVAC workforce is going to be the one doing the IAQ issues? They're going to be the frontline soldiers. Joe Allen from Harvard has actually stated that in as many words a bunch of times in presentations. I mean, what do you think?
Sure. I mean, so the answer is, can you provide? Because these are the questions that keep me up at night, that I spend a lot of time talking in mastermind sessions and private conversations with folks. And that question always comes up: is what are we going to do about the skills gap? What are we going to do about the retiring technicians and replacing them with the next generation of techs? What are we going to do about the fact that we're already behind the 8 ball in terms of skills in the labor market? The answer is that if tradespeople continue to be disrespected and treated like they're a commodity, then sure, you're going to have a labor issue. If tradespeople are treated as professionals who are respected on the same ground as all of us and all the talking heads out there, all the people who write documents and have college degrees, as soon as they're treated with that same level of respect, are compensated for their sweat and blood equity that they put into it, then you're going to get more of them. But as it stands right now, this is the challenge that we all face. People always say, well, how can we get more people into the trade? It's like, how can we pay more? How can we pay people more in the trade? How can we treat them with more respect in the trade? And then people are kind of like, well, the market forces. It's like, right, exactly. And until those incentives begin to really incentivize the correct things, rather than just creating this echo chamber of conversation between people who really aren't doing it, or I shouldn't say they're not doing anything about it, but they're not physically doing anything about it, then these problems aren't going to be solved. And so I think it's a value system problem that there are a lot more people who are beginning to work on. And I'm very hopeful. I'm not cynical about the long-term outcomes, but that's the problem we got to solve for. It's not just like, all right, we need to hire more people. Okay. And I'm competing against Target in terms of what I can pay. So there's a challenge that the business models have to support that.
And the second initiative that we'll discuss in a little bit is the Inflation Reduction Act, which in theory does talk about getting wages up and in line where they would need to be to actually incentivize these things. But that's a big problem, right? I mean, everybody's having a labor crunch, but the marketplace doesn't really allow us, right? The competitiveness in the marketplace doesn't allow you to pay people significantly more money than they're getting paid now.
Well, I'll jump in here. To
Sure.
me, this is something we're trying to solve within the HVAC 2.0 program. So we're just about to roll out the free quote process, which at least educates people on the pieces that we're talking about: good filtration, dehumidification, humidification, outdoor air, load matching, all of these pieces. Because fundamentally, we also have an education problem amongst homeowners. So if we come in and talk to them, particularly like at the sales call, they're going to have their defenses up. So they need to be educated in a non-threatening manner, and then also be offered the right options for doing these sorts of things. And how much measurement needs to be involved in that? That's a good question, and that's a tough one. Are we going to put air quality monitors in everyone's house? Probably not. But we can at least offer things, we used the standard system that we did with Energy Smart when we were doing all these projects was a MERV 11 filter. I did a webinar with RetroTech like 4 days after lockdown or a week after lockdown. I'm like, all right, it's not 11 anymore, it's 13, because we already had the research at that point that showed that would catch things. So great, we can do MERV 13 filters. They've gotten to where they don't have huge filter drops anymore. It's not really a problem as long as we put a big enough filter in the system. So we can do all of these things, but if we aren't educating clients and they're understanding, seeing the value in it, and then being willing to pay more for what those services are, it's going to be a challenge. Because again, fundamentally, there's a limit to what you can pay technicians. And one of the best things we can do is to increase ticket sizes so that we've got more margin to work with. We can pay them more.
But the thing is, increasing ticket size, you have to increase value too, obviously, right? I mean, and that's really the key. It's not because I think traditionally there's been this, and I'm not singling out the HVAC industry for this, but to do add-on sales, indoor air quality related, IAQ related add-on sales, and the thought is, well, you can put UVC bulb in, or you can put electronic air cleaner system or something. I mean, because there's something that a tangible device they can sell. There's a price, you can put it on, add it in there, but that's not necessarily assessing what's actually happening in that client space and providing exactly what they need. So
it may not be solving the problem anyway.
Yeah,
it might possibly be making things worse depending on the product.
Potentially.
So
yeah. So,
And that's so we're talking a lot about residential, but this isn't just
right.
residential. This
In
is
fact, it's not the building challenge is more. I would say it's more
it's more so
institutional and
commercial, right?
commercial. Yeah.
Right. And that's so a good example of this is kind of what I'm driving at here. At the Westford Symposium this year, they talked about the changes that they made to the Westford Regency for the conference. And so they were talking about, okay, here's the things we wanted to do. We wanted to put, room air cleaners in. We wanted to have UV in the space. We wanted to improve, put in higher MERV filters. But then they talked about what they found when they actually went to the equipment to attempt to put higher MERV filters in there. And you find that like the filters that are even in there right now don't fit, and nobody knows the proper sizes. And even when you put the proper sizes in, there's gaps and cracks all around them. And then you put the higher MERV filters in. Well, now the blowers don't move the air that they're supposed to move. So now you have to completely redo the test and balance, or you have to replace the motor. It's like, this is the challenge, is that this isn't a simple thing. It isn't like, hey, take your MERV 8s out and put MERV 13s in. Most of these things, or not, I shouldn't say most, but a good portion of them are in giant filter banks, or they're in rooftop units in these ill-fitting spaces.
Right.
And we often miss the trees because of the forest. Like this is a problem that's made up of trees. This is a problem that's made up of tons of tiny little things. And this is what I always hammer with my technicians. It's like, I don't care what filter you put in if it doesn't fit right. It doesn't matter. If there's gaps and cracks around it, it doesn't matter what filter you put in. And often people are paying for a lot of really expensive solutions that are doing very little, when the actual problems could be solved by a little bit of being a master of the obvious. And that's kind of the thing.
Phrase.
That's Jim Bergman's phrase, by the way, masters of the obvious. He says that all the time.
Great phrase.
So that's what we have to work on. And again, this talks about, this covers a lot of that stuff, but it's not, it has to be in specificity, and consumers, whether those consumers are institutional, commercial, residential, they have to value those things, because it still takes time, and it takes somebody who's really good at their job spending the time in order to find all these obvious things and then replace them, and then come up with all the more advanced, because that's kind of my stance, is that most of these things are either fairly easy to fix and can be fixed pretty inexpensively, or very expensive to fix and require major renovations. I think there's very little middle ground there, because you get into that. What would the soft middle even be? It would be adding outdoor air to a system that doesn't even have it. Well, that's not easy.
No.
Yeah, if it doesn't have an economizer and you can upgrade it with an economizer, maybe, but even that's not that inexpensive, and it requires a lot of skill to set it up. So there doesn't feel like a lot of soft middle. There's repairing issues that are obvious, that should have always been fixed, and nobody ever solved it. And then there's major upgrades.
So, I mean, do you think it makes to me, it makes sense to go after the low-lying fruit? I always do, as an IQ investigator and consulting, there's usually a plethora of issues happening in most situations where there's an indoor environmental issue. I mean, not always. Sometimes it's a very cut and dry, but a lot of times it's a mix of things. So, I mean, I always recommend you go after the low-lying fruit, the stuff that can readily be addressed, changed, corrected, and incrementally try to make improvement, right? Does that make sense in this aspect?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And that's what I'm saying. The problem is that when you read a document like this, you immediately think about upgrades you can do. For example, saying, put in MERV 13 filters. Everybody's like, it's funny. I had Consumer Reports called me. This is a little bit of a little bit of a side note, but it applies. They called me to talk about air filtration, and I think they thought it was going to be a really simple thing. And I could just watch their brains melting with frustration, because they're like, we're trying to teach consumers what filter to put in. We don't want you to keep talking about pressure drops and and all this other stuff. And that's the problem, is that you can't just tell somebody what filter to put in. You can't just say put in a MERV 13 filter, because that doesn't work unless you're somehow dealing with creating a deeper filter, so that way you keep the pressure drops the same or less. Those are the challenges that we face. And so my suggestion is, this is really more of a training and accountability thing more than anything. And most of it, if we're talking about the commercial and institutional side, goes to those stationary engineers, because they're the ones who usually jack everything up. They go in and they disable everything, or it doesn't have to be that way, or they put the wrong filters in, or whatever. And nobody's training them, and nobody's holding them accountable to make sure that it's done. Yes, it is the outside service providers. Those also need that training. But this document doesn't do that. This document doesn't train on how to deal with ill-fitting filters. It doesn't talk about what you do if you want to retrofit a system with outdoor air or with an economizer. Those are the things that I think we have to begin to specify out if we actually want to move the needle.
We had a comment come in over in the community that I just figured it would be worth putting up there. And this is at the homeowners, but where or when do you educate homeowners in a non-threatening way? But I think the same question could be with commercial as well, because if you're going in and telling, the stationary engineer that, you've done a piss poor job for a long time here, that's not going to, that messaging doesn't really go over well with people. Nobody likes to be told they're doing a bad job.
I mean, the answer there is before you arrive at the building, I think. It would be that the home or the commercial building. So if you want someone to understand something that's going on, send them a piece of content before you go, or have it on your website, and have it be or feel third party. And, don't use scare tactics and so forth in there. Just be just the facts, ma'am.
And that happens a lot. I mean, the IQ industry, again, now going back to to my industry, is notorious for doing that. For puffing stuff up, sensationalizing stuff, trying to scare the bejesus out of people. I mean, honestly, deadly toxic black mold, and things like that. So it's not like any sector in this industry has really been good at articulating in a reasonable, educational mode, using empathy, as opposed to using scare tactics. I don't know how we get around that. We've got a question here. Actually, Joe Madosh is in there. Hey, Joe Madosh. Question from Joe Madosh. He was talking about just from a bit back when we were having the testing done. How would we, what would an HVAC tech, if they were even had the diagnostic equipment to go out and start measuring the outside air and doing all this extra work, what would that even mean to them?
Good luck with the interpretation on that. I mean, I've stared at an awful lot of these things. I mean, I was one of the early people diving into the consumer grade monitors and looking at things and seeing what happened, and asking my clients, "Did you open a window?" And they think I'm crazy because I saw their VOC spike all of a sudden. That's a pretty major lift in and of itself to be a diagnostician for air quality. So it's a good question, Joe, and it's not a simple solution. Bryan, would you agree?
Yeah, and so here's a short speech. Okay, this is one of the most controversial things that I say to people like y'all, but I think it's worth saying that our grandmothers gave us the best advice. They always did. And every time we start to measure stuff, every time we create policies and procedures and do different things, we come back to hey, guess what? Grandma actually had some really good points. Hey, you need to get some fresh air. You need to drink plenty of water. That's a good idea. Hey, go out and get some exercise, right? A lot of this stuff, it feels musty in here. We need to open the windows. It's musty in here. A lot of this stuff is fairly obvious. And yet we will say things like, prescription without, I think this may even be your thing, so I'm not mocking you, Nate, but prescription without diagnosis is malpractice. Some version of that is said all the time. But our grandmothers didn't have measurement tools. They just had really good experiences that were fairly evident. And sometimes I think we get locked up and we say, well, I can't do anything unless I can measure. Well, guess what? In IAQ, we've been doing stuff without measuring this whole dang time. Because even if we can measure some stuff, it's a tiny, tiny subset. I mean, you look at the home chem study and what we learned from that, it's hey, guess what? There's all kinds of crap we can't measure and we're not measuring because it's too expensive to measure. And it's the outcomes are so blah. The more you look, the more you find, and you're what do we do with all this? But if you look at spaces that have really good outcomes, we just know there's some basic things that they do really well. Right? It's not super complicated. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if your air is going around the filter rather than through the filter, it's not getting filtered, right? We don't have to be rocket scientists to know that if the media is more dense and the particles impact the media more, it's going to catch more stuff. We don't have to be rocket science to know the more dense it is, the harder it's going to be for the air to pass through it, right?
Right.
And this is my point. It's yes, do we need measurement for some of this stuff? Absolutely. But a lot of it, I think we're actually just wasting our time rather than just being super practical and just saying, let's start there. And as we get better at measuring, then let's measure things that are valuable. So, PM 2.5, Yeah, it's a pretty good thing to measure, right? We know CO. Yeah, definitely. We need to make sure that people aren't going to die of carbon monoxide. That's a pretty good one. Things like carbon dioxide, man, that's a tricky one to measure. Like I'd love to. It'd be helpful if we could accurately measure it all the time, but it's a tricky one.
Well,
So
it's nice
maybe
because you
don't.
got to think of occupant density. There's a lot of other factors. It's not that CO2 meter, by itself, it could look great. You could have great low CO2 readings because your occupant density is low, and it could be the building could be full of all types of off-gassing
Other
chemicals
chemicals,
and all
exactly.
kinds of stuff going on. And you think, oh, we got plenty of ventilation here, and in fact, you don't.
Right. But even that is just the sensor technology, and the calibration protocols for the sensors are much more challenging with CO2 sensors, at least the typical ones that we see off the shelf. So there's just so much to know with this. And when you're talking about translating this to a field worker who by their very nature is blue collar, they like solving hands-on problems. They're good at all kinds of stuff that people who sit in offices all day aren't good at.
Yep. And
yet we criticize them for not being good at measuring and troubleshooting and all these things that are really complicated. But if we were given the same tools, we couldn't do it. And that's to me what frustrates me. It's like, can we be a little bit more clear about what the things are that they really can do? And then if it's something that's a bigger problem, well, then we need to bring probably somebody in who's a specialist to be able to really diagnose and troubleshoot that problem. I think expecting that out of your average AC technician, given all the other things we expect them to already measure and do, is getting a little absurd.
Yeah, you're asking a fish to fly. So that's not what you're going to get. And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, as much as we can all rail against being prescriptive, there's a lot of things that you kind of know that you should do anyway. So like in doing all of that measurements with it was Fubots primarily we were using. The whole badass HVAC design came out of that, which is pretty simple. It's one system. And you've got a good filter on it. You've got a large drop, or the plenum to the return is very large. You bring in a little outdoor air. We like systems that have reheat dehumidification, so you don't have to have a separate dehumidifier. So at least it's done with one piece of equipment. And when you do those things, even if you can't do anything to control the air quality, because that's the other issue, is until recently, you could know what was wrong with the air quality, but on the residential side, you really had no tool to be able to actually control it. So we found that if you just do these good things, you've got humidification for climates that need it, you have dehumidification, you have fresh air, you have filtration, you have load matching equipment, you're going to have good comfort and air quality as a default. Doesn't mean it won't get out of line sometimes, but we have a pretty good idea of the stuff that we need to do.
To your point, unless there's something wrong with the envelope, with the structure, and then that's where you need to fix it, right? And that's the other thing is so often we're like, the envelope matters. I agree. Everybody who knows anything about this agrees, but at AC Tech, like, come on, like we're getting a little bit unrealistic about what they're going to do. But that doesn't mean they can't do their part really well. It's just as unrealistic to tell somebody who does, the insulation in the house to be responsible for the AC installation. Their job is to do the insulation right. The AC technician's job is to do their system right. And if everybody does their piece right, you end up with a good house. Any one of those things break down, you're going to have a problem, even if you do everything else right. But that should never, again, this was my perspective as a contractor, of course. That's not the HVAC contractor's responsibility. There's a few who may want to take that on, and that's great, but it's never going to be the norm. We're being unrealistic to think it would be.
So then who is the steward of this? Who's the responsible party that's going to do the triage and going to oversee and make sure that all these different players put the pieces together right in a building?
Well, it's funny, Brian, you and I will disagree on this one because I think it can be the HVAC contractor, but it's not the HVAC technician that's involved here. It's actually going to be more of the salesperson, so that you can do the triage and understand how screwed up is the house, what things do the people want to solve, what's their budget to do it, and begin to pull those together. Now, I'm just speaking residential, so on the commercial side, that's a whole nother story, but fundamentally it would be something similar, I would think, as well, but that it gets muddy too, because now you're mixing sales and diagnostics. So you have to be kind of cautious how you structure that sort of thing.
Well, building performance has done that forever, though. I mean, at least in New York, right? I mean, the whole NYSERDA program does that. I mean, salespeople that are doing the home energy audit. I mean, for better or worse.
You have to be careful how you structure that, because like there are free audits in New York now where the contractor gets paid $250, but they need to be free to the homeowner. $250 doesn't get you any good diagnostics. It gets you a sales pitch. That's all it gets you.
Pretty much. And
And
a card deck that, or a slide deck that shows you why you need new windows.
yeah, right.
Don't even
Yeah,
get me started
exactly.
on that.
Everything. So yeah, there's also fundamentally a sales process problem underneath all of
Sure.
this, and how do you make sure that that is ethical and how it happens?
Yeah, that's challenging. We have a question from the community. Let me pop that up here. Dave Lipton. Many stakeholders, actually, this is more of a comment, but many stakeholders who design, own, operate, maintain, and occupy buildings may have different goals that may be in conflict, and looking for quick, easy fix solutions. I think that's
Yeah.
definitely the case. So how do we address something like that?
Well, that's again a triage problem and an education problem, which we need to get paid to do. This is not something that should be done for free.
Yeah, and also like a lot of the questions that we end up asking is like how do we change human nature? It's like yeah, like so and this is kind of goes back to even the last thing that we were talking about. When we look at things that we're going to try to do, because that's so much of what we're talking about here. We're not talking about how things are, we're talking about how we want things to be. You have to look at some examples of this happening in the past. And I think you're going to have a hard time finding some really good ones of people who are both really good at sales, really good at communication, really good at diagnostics and troubleshooting, motivated by all the right things. You give them incentives. And this is just the case of how human nature works. You give somebody incentives, they're going to find a way to abuse that and turn it into a perverse incentive, find the shortcut in order to get the $250. In Florida, it's the Florida Energy Code. I mean, it's a joke. It's not a joke because the people who did it were well-meaning. They're people like us who are looking to solve a real problem. But the reason it's a joke is because the people who do it are like, how do I do this in the least expensive possible way to get the inspector to give me a permit? That's all this is about. Just give me the dang permit. It isn't to say that there aren't incremental improvements that occur because of that. And I think that's the piece that we can kind of hang our hats on and be happy about, is that when we have these conversations and we see things like this new clean air initiative and others, they can make incremental changes towards something that's good. But at the end of the day, there has to be business models where people make money and salespeople sell and troubleshooters troubleshoot and business owners run businesses. And that's how it works, because people are motivated by what they're motivated by. And us standing up there saying you should be motivated by something different doesn't make them change who they are. Right. And so as far as business owners and the joke is about contractors, it's like, how am I going to get a contractor to care about anything but money? It's like,
You're going to get a consultant to care about anything but money. I mean,
right? Like be their mother. Like like how do you? No, of course you can't. They're adults. You can't get people to care about things they don't care about. But you can begin to create structures and businesses and systems that start to just keep people in their lane. For example, a construction superintendent shouldn't be making decisions about the IAQ design of a structure or what ends up happening in that structure. They should stay in their lane about what a superintendent does, and that's just how it's going to work. That's how it will always work.
So I'm going to shift gears now, and let's talk a little bit about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And I know this is something that's near and dear to Nate. Nate's been talking about this a lot, and you're going to be doing ISP Radio tomorrow, the whole show on it, right? So I'll tee you up.
Well, I don't know if I'd say near and dear, but
yeah, well, something you spent some time looking at. How about that?
Well, we actually have no choice in the HVAC industry to not be aware of what this is and begin to have a strategy for it. So there's actually 3 different programs that came through the IRA. So there is the federal one. Oh, thank you. There's a slide. So this is the short version, if you will. This is one of like 30 slides that I have for tomorrow. So there is the federal tax incentive, which that used to be a $1,500 cap, lifetime cap. That is now $1,200 per year or $2,000 per year for heat pumps or heat pump water heaters. And then I've also heard from a few people that it may be stackable, even though the language in it really doesn't sound that way. And important note in all of this, we have no rules yet. So everything that I'm commenting here is from the bill. So we know nothing about what's actually going to happen. In fact, the IRS just asked, like today, for comments about how to structure the federal incentives. So, and it would be good if we all kind of get together and talk about what's a good way to structure these so they don't make our lives miserable in the future. So anyway, there's the federal piece, and that does not appear to have a budget, and it's going to be here for a decade. So we need to get used to whatever that is and how we're going to use it. Then there are 2 state rebate programs. So one is called Hope for Homes, and that's actually like a 10-year-old bill that just came through. It got spun around enough that it passed finally. That has a $4.3 billion budget that gets split between the states. So the states are running all of this. And that is either $2,000 or $4,000 for modeled energy savings or actual, which will be super interesting after the fact. So there's that. Then there's the second program, which is called the High Efficiency Electric Homes Program. And that's $4.5 billion. And that gets you up to $14,000 for various upgrades. Now, there are a lot of rules on this. The state programs have pretty strict income qualifications. So if you are under 80% of low to moderate income, so median income for your area, you'll qualify for more money. It's either a higher percentage of the job cost, or for multifamily, there's bigger rebates for it. Or if you are between 80 and 150% of median income, there's another thing. But if you are above that, you don't qualify for any of the state stuff as it's written. Now, one of the curses here is this is going to states. So we are going to get 50 different sets of rules. So there's nothing that I can say that will be true nationwide. So the federal maybe, and again, this is just from reading the bill. So a couple of pieces to note here. The state programs, you aren't allowed to double dip. If you use one, you can't use the other. And then the federal heat pump specific rebate, which is $2,000, that requires, it says in the bill, it says the highest tier of CEE. Coalition for Energy Efficiency, I believe. So it has to be highest tier, which is tier 3, which is currently 18 SEER. And, Bryan and I both know 18 SEER, when you get into 3, 4, and 5 ton equipment, is not an easy thing. So if you buy an 18 SEER class piece of equipment, it's actually going to be 16, maybe 17, 17 and a half, but it won't be 18. So we need to move into 20 SEER equipment in general to be able to do that. And that's oftentimes a $2,000 or $3,000 bump in equipment. So you're not really ahead of the game.
Your incentives are basically going to be chewed up by the fact that you're putting more expensive equipment in to achieve the incentive. Yeah.
Yep. And some of the equipment's worth it, but a lot of it, I don't really think it is. So it's going to be a challenge. My other big concern there too is if we are moving to electrification, one thing we need to be super careful with, going back to the air quality discussion, is that if we size for heating, heat loads are in general about double cooling, depending where you are in the country. It's a larger delta between indoor and outdoor temperature, so you get a higher load. If you size a heat pump for heat load, it's pretty much for sure going to be oversized for cooling. And then we're running higher efficiency equipment, which tends to not be quite as good at dehumidification. Depends on the piece of equipment. Yeah. Depends on the equipment. There's some exceptions, but it can be dangerous. So if we aren't careful here, we're going to end up making people sick. I did a presentation for IAQ radio called The Coming Mold Explosion a few years ago, because we're seeing all kinds of weird stuff start to happen between increased dew points and then increased efficiencies, increased rainfall. There's all these things that are making moisture really challenging. So part of me is kind of nervous about using SEER as the razor that we're deciding where is this. There's a cliff there.
And that's an issue anywhere. It's not just, obviously Bryan's down the Orlando area, so it's critical. I mean, you're in high, the latent load down there. You're dealing with so much humidity. A slight error is a major error down there. But what you're describing here, Nate, this is something that would happen anywhere, right? In any climate, improperly sized equipment.
East Coast. So
okay, mostly, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, or eastern side of the country. So I didn't really understand dry climate until we took that camper trip a couple years ago, and it was a 70-degree day with a 9-degree dew point. In Cleveland, we don't see 9-degree dew points until it's 9 degrees. So that messes with my mind how dry it can be. So there's some climates that it's not as big of a worry, but for a huge chunk of U.S. population, if we're not careful here, we can make people sick.
Well, and another issue, Joe Madash put this in the comments. Rather than bring it across, I'll just read it. Again, heat pumps, retrofitting with heat pump equipment, right, with existing ductwork.
Mhm.
There's a duct size issue too, right? I mean, this is
Definitely.
not. You don't just pull out a conventional furnace AC system and throw in a heat pump to an existing duct system and have everything match up right. Correct, guys? I mean,
Yeah,
Well, you
generally
have all
no.
heat
I
pumps.
mean, yeah, and I mean, well, I mean, so yeah, that's why I always kind of caveat. It's like it's funny when people say air conditioning, I immediately think heat pump because that's what I've always worked on. That's my market in Central Florida. But yeah, I mean, when you work in markets where you have these, existing, basement duct systems with very poor airflow to begin with, and now you just throw a heat pump in, that's a recipe for disaster. Especially if you are trying to upsize in order to try to, catch a little bit of that heating load. It's tricky, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like you can't be prescriptive without being really clear about all the caveats. And with some of this stuff, there's a lot of them. And again, this is the issue that I have with, I was trying to find the right word. We'll just say issue that I have with any of these sorts of things is that who does it benefit? And a lot would argue that, okay, it benefits the environment and it benefits the consumer because they're getting some money back. And that's true so long as they're actually getting what they're paying for. But the companies, the contractors that it benefits are contractors that have a really strong sales arm, that are really good at selling stuff and getting some copy and grabbing it and going to the client and selling it, right? And those aren't the best contractors. Those are the contractors that are going to oversize stuff. They're the contractors who aren't going to change the ductwork. They're the contractors who aren't going to provide the whole solutions. And that's what is a lot of what happens in these things. And we've seen this with past incentives too. It just ends up, you get this influx of sales, but you don't really solve the root problems because that's not what's being incentivized. You're once again incentivizing
right.
boxes and the numbers that are listed on the boxes. And we're getting to the point now where that's diminishing returns. Now, when you're talking about transitioning something from a furnace to a heat pump, which is a lot of what this is about, sure, that's better. But even that, I mean, Nate knows of all people because he's done a lot of these. There's stuff that has to be dealt with in order to do that properly. And the people best suited to do that are not the ones who are going to benefit most from federal incentives.
Well, I mean, that's been a problem, anytime we try to regulate a solution or a fix, right? Because I mean, you can go to mold licensing to everything in the indoor environmental industry. It's like there's always a knee-jerk reaction. There's a political thing. There's some legislation passed, and I think mostly good intentions behind it.
Mm.
And there's usually, if they are prescriptive, they're usually not the right prescriptive measures, and because again, it's people are writing this legislation and approving this legislation that don't understand this stuff. And I've just seen this happen so many times, and I think this is a classic case. You've got some of because again, the White House is leaning on guidance from a certain group of experts, that they're chosen experts, and they're going to have certain opinions, and everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's got an agenda. Every organization, every company, right? I mean, so the
No,
thing is,
100%.
yeah, and
I
that's
was
that's
actually
human nature. Back to
frustrated
what
this
Brian
went
said
through the
earlier. I
way
mean,
it
it
went.
is human nature, but
Yeah. Yeah, you have to take that into account. But yeah, I was actually somewhat frustrated this made it through, because I can see so many different sales process things. And one of my biggest recommendations would be, having seen a bunch of programs through the years, is don't build your sales process or your business model around this program, because the odds are decent that it will change in one way or another and then shift which way it goes.
and
So
you have
that's
this
a
this
tricky
bell
thing.
clip. I think this is a good segue to that
Yep.
too.
Yeah, that's a great thing to look at this. So really my biggest fear with this is, if it isn't done well, we're going to provide very bad experiences for both contractors and homeowners. So that's what we don't want, because that makes scale not happen. So this is from Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, which, if you are in business at all, you really should read this book. It's not a long one. It's a good one. It's simple. But he talks about technology adoption. When something new comes out, you start off with the technology enthusiasts at the beginning, or the innovators. And the next piece are your early adopters in the orange. And then if you don't create a whole product, you can't cross the chasm to the mainstream. Now, how this applies to incentives in particular is, typically these incentives never make it past that chasm. So you start getting a few people excited. You get your early adopters coming. The first few people come through, and this is me comparing, in theory, a typical efficiency program versus a market-based program. So early on, you're like, "Woohoo! Look, we're winning. This is awesome. Look how good this is." Go to the next one, Bob. But what happens is you take the incentives away after a while, and all that juice and momentum that you got goes away. Where if you had done it with a more market-based way of looking at it for fully converting the entire market, that could actually be useful. So like what we proposed, so I mean, I love Teddy Roosevelt's line of complaining without proposing a solution is called whining. So
I do that a lot, but
yeah, it's me too. But I try, and we try to put helpful things out there. So there's actually a piece of legislation with an idea that I proposed on Twitter a year and a half ago that's out. And basically it just suggests, let's stop making air conditioners and start making all heat pumps so that everything at least becomes a hybrid moving forward. Which would have been a much simpler way to do this and could have converted the whole market. But my big fear here is we're going to have a couple years of excitement, but then probably some mediocre results. And then the incentives will go away, at least at the state level, and demand will crash from that. And if we give enough people bad experiences, I mean, does anybody here have a bad review on their website? Like bad reviews get
rid of
lot.
those. We just erase those.
Yeah, good, good. So you figured that out.
Best, yeah. Oh yeah. It's called selective, moderation. But so I mean, so we've been talking about these two different things: the IRA, right, which is now it's legislation. So that's there. So that's going to happen in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
They haven't put out the specifics, but this is coming. And then you've got the clean air building challenge, which might be more aptly described as the challenge to having clean air in buildings, because it's not really prescriptive. It's got some ideas, but there's nothing that's forcing that to happen. It's just sort of like a blueprint, a very loose 10,000 foot blueprint of what could be done. Whereas the IRA is something that's going to happen.
It's coming. Yeah. January 1st, we get the federal, and sometime probably the middle of next year, the state programs will start coming through. But we can at least put some feedback in. So I'll send you the link, Bob, where we can go make comments on the IRS site, because they're looking for comments by November 4th. So if you have ideas for how to avoid some of these things, I mean, probably my biggest suggestion would be, even though it will end up spending a crap ton of our money, would be to move it from a tier 3 requirement to a tier 2, which would be 16 SEER. And all of a sudden we get a whole lot more options and better things can happen. So that's just one thought.
So I mean, I guess overview, because we're getting low on the clock here, because I knew this was going to happen. We're covering a lot of territory in a short time. And to both of you, how, I mean, what if you're going to crystal ball it a little bit? And I'm going to put you on the spot. How do you see the market will be impacted in 2023 and maybe 24 and beyond, but by both of these initiatives and some of the other stuff that's in the works? Or are these things still just pie in the sky that really are more puffery and not going to move the needle that much? Brian, what do you think on this? Do you see things changing?
As far as clean air in buildings, I don't think it's going to change anything as it is. Now, let's see what happens. If they take a harder stance against some of the products like PCOs or bipolar needlepoint, then that could change some things. And I think some of that might be coming. We'll see. So, that's that. No, nothing. The other, it'll have the same impact that it's had in the past. Why wouldn't it? And the first thing that's going to be really, really fun is that we already can't get equipment, and now we're going to be incentivizing people to buy equipment, which is going to be awesome for the AC contractor. I'm joking. It's going to be horrible. It's because we are way behind. I mean, we can't, and this is commercial, residential, it's across the board. I mean, there was a period where we just couldn't get 3-ton heat pumps, carrier heat pumps. We just couldn't get them. It's going to be a couple months, So it's a nightmare as far as that goes, as far as product availability. Let's say that somehow all of a sudden the products are available and we can get them. It's going to do the same thing that it did before, where you will get a lot of people who buy equipment Good sales organizations will put out a lot of marketing about act now because it's going to go away or whatever, and they'll get a lot of people to buy it. And life goes on. It's the prices of this stuff is already going up so fast that it's not going to have like a massive consumer impact, at least from my perspective. And again, I don't fully understand some of that. So like, what does that mean over 10 years? I don't like, does that mean you get to take that credit every year for 10 years? I don't fully understand what that even
means.
It's
one time, and it's actually only on your house for this. So you have to own it. So like we have Airbnbs, and I can't get that for those.
It's going to be very similar to what it was before. And like we said, if it's pushing people into a higher tier, it's going to get eaten up. You'll sell a lot higher tier equipment, but that's the exact stuff we can't get right now. Inverter drives and all that stuff. So it's like, okay, great. But it's another just tone deaf effort by people who write policies to do something that makes them feel good. And it sounds really nice at dinner parties where they talk about how sad the great unwashed are and how we're all so sad and how can they help us, right? But but that's right.
No, you're right, Brian.
That's the
I
reality.
totally agree with you.
And they're very sad and they have very sad conversations about the poor tradespeople and how their lives are so difficult and all that. But at the end of the day, to actually get in and really fundamentally understand and actually give people voice who are really struggling with this stuff, it's too messy, right? So instead, let's just write something down.
Nate,
fully agree. So this probably wouldn't be a popular conversation on energy Twitter where I interact a lot. I'm just concerned. I'm like, this is going to be a pain in the butt, and I kind of wish it didn't exist, but we're going to have to deal with it.
Okay. And again, will it morph? I don't know. I mean, again, the challenge is such a loose thing. It's it's basically like a wish list blueprint is what that is. Whereas obviously the Inflation Reduction Act is legislation that's going to come to pass. So without a doubt, there's going to be changes in the industry. I'm going to give you each like a final point. I'm going to start with Brian and Nate. I'll let you do the last one. Just thoughts overall and your sage wisdom, because I respect the input of both of you guys. You guys are both people that are out there working in the industry, but also out there educating the industry, and I think that's enormous. Both of you, kudos to both of you. Brian, your podcast and your HVACR school, that's really phenomenal. And Nate, you've been writing and authoring, and you're all over the place doing webinars and seminars. So anyway, Brian, I'll give you a final shot here.
Sure. I want to end by just saying that sometimes when I give those little diatribes or rants, people will think that I'm super cynical, and I'm not. The very same people who I just criticized are my friends in many cases. I'm not. I'm open to criticism on my faults, and I'm also going to criticize folks who I think sometimes don't do the things that they should do. And what I think we need to do is just give voice to the people who actually have to deal with the pain, have to deal with the suffering of what's being put in place. Yes, we know that these things are going to happen, and they always will. But maybe spend a little less time patting ourselves on the back about the progress we're making, and realize that a lot of times this progress happens naturally anyway, because a lot of the people who are doing it actually do care about the right things. They're just very busy, and it's very hard for them to find the time to address it. So I think just engaging with folks who actually do care, who are on the front lines, that's what we need to do more of when we're writing these regulations. And then I think they'll be better than they are now.
I definitely concur. So Nate, final words? Not final words, it's final words for today for the show. Nate's final words.
I'm not gone for the day, or this is the end of my life. No, but I agree, Brian. It's making sure that as a lot of these programs are being rolled out, that they are realistic. So actually, I'm in the middle of adding a little section to an international heat pump policy paper where I'm suggesting just that, like, make sure that business model is taken into account, because if you just tell people to do something and you send them the training, they're going to ignore the training and they're not going to apply it. You need to make sure that you're taking those things into account and what the real world boots on the ground situation is. So yeah, that is a key thing. And one last thing too, again, we do have an opportunity to put some feedback in. Is it time well spent? I can't guarantee it. But if we at least make suggestions, at least later we can point back to that.
So, a topic that's not going away soon. We'll be talking about this more. In fact, on the 20th, we have Bill Spohn, and I believe Joe Madosh is going to. We're going to pull him out of the sidelines and bring him back. He used to be the co-host of the show back many moons ago, and we'll have a kind of a follow up to this because I think it is a discussion that warrants a lot more looking at. So yeah, that's we're unfortunately we've spun up our time already. And I certainly appreciate both of you guys taking times out of your what are undoubtedly very busy days. Again, if you're watching the show on some other portal after the fact, because you may be on the Healthy Indoors online global community platform, or you may be looking at LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, any number of other places. Global.healthyindoors.com is the home base for this. There's an actual show page, and you can get all the back all the back episodes as well as all the back issues of Healthy Indoors magazine. So I want to thank both of our guests here, Bryan Orr, Nate Adams, for being on the show again today, and hopefully we'll have you guys on. Well, you're going to be on again too, Nate.
Yeah, 27th coming up.
27th. Yep. Why did I not say that? That's right. You're on the 27th. So we've
You
got.
forgot.
I did.
I see how it is, Bob.
I you know what? Because I don't have notes. I mean, I'll admit those notes weren't here. So I'm like Ron Burgundy. You can put anything in the teleprompter and I'll read it. So not quite, but close to it. So anyway, that's our show for today. We really appreciate you guys being here. Everybody coming on board and watching it. If you're watching it after the fact, again, you can go to the community and comment after the fact, and we'll pass those on to both of our guests if there's follow-up questions or comments or whatever. So I guess without further ado, we'll see you guys. Oh, next week. Yeah, I forgot about next week's show. Sharon Kramer, who has been an advocate in the mold space for many, many years. She'll be our guest next week. Following week on the 20th, we've got Bill Spohn, Joe Madosh. And on the 27th, thanks for pointing it out, Nate. Nate Adams will be back talking about other stuff, right? Or probably some of the same stuff. But so until next week and until next time, I'm Bob Krell, founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors. Stay healthy.